Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I hear a louder good morning? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, thank you so much. I think a little bit more energy, and we'll begin with our first session. So yesterday we've witnessed numerous discussions, explored various possibilities and opportunities, but yes, as it is said, it'll only happen if we take these opportunities and possibilities and turn them into reality. So now, taking this further, once again, we welcome all of you to the IAS 11th World Congress on Adolescent Health, and today is day 2. And yes, we are ready to witness some more interesting discussions that are coming up, ideas and perspectives that our speakers and experts have to share with us. And not taking your more time, our topic for today is young people changing the future of adolescent health, migration and adolescent health. And it gives me immense pleasure to invite our session chair for this first session, Dr. Bruce Dick, past President IAH. Welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you here. I request you to please come forward and take your seat on the dais. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more co-chair for this session, Dr. Anupam Sachdev. He's incoming president for Indian Academy of Pediatrics. Welcome, Dr. Anupam Sachdeva. It's a pleasure to have you here. And now I would request our session chairs to take this session further. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So I hope you all had an interesting and networking day yesterday and a nice evening. Managed to enjoy some of the sights and foods of India. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here and to have the meeting here in Delhi. Having been involved from the very beginning with the decision, I can tell you that it has not always been smooth sailing, but wonderful that we're all here. Just so exciting. So we'll have 2 keynotes today. I will introduce the first one, and Anupam Sachdeva will introduce the second one. The first keynote is the Herb Friedman lecture. Herb was a psychologist, both a clinical psychologist and a research psychologist. And he worked at WHO for about 20 years. And he was really the first person in the organization to shine the light on adolescence, on adolescent health, and certainly one of the champions who moved this agenda globally from the 80s. He was in many ways ahead of his time. Among other things, he stressed constantly the importance of adolescent development, including adolescent sexual development, to the overall health of adolescents. And I was reminded about this yesterday when we had the session on mental health, about how essential giving adequate attention to adolescent development is when we're thinking about adolescent health. He emphasized the need to focus on adolescents on this period of the life course, not only for the health of adolescents, but also for their health when they were adults and for the health of their children. And he was championing this decades, I would say, before the idea of the triple dividend really got internalized. He highlighted the importance of relationships And again, I was reminded about this when we had the session yesterday on positive youth development. He always stressed the need to integrate our responses to adolescent health. And I have it on good authority, in fact, that it was Herb who coined the phrase adolescent sexual and reproductive health that was used in the Cairo conference in the ICPD. And he pioneered training for counseling. And again, this is a concept that is rippling through this Congress. His passion, his insights, his tireless work ethic has influenced many of the people who have led the field of adolescent health over the last 20 years, and many of them are here today. Bob Blum, Pierre-André Michaud, David Bennett, of course, Chandra Mouli, Matti Maddaleno, and of course Jane Ferguson, with whom he worked for many years at WHO. They really were the original A-team. I was also fortunate to work with Herb in the early 90s, and I look back at that time to a friend and mentor, but to someone who I actually often disagreed with. But over the years, on a number of things, on most of the things I would say, I subsequently had to learn the hard way that in fact Herb was right. So he would have been so happy to have seen such a wonderful turnout for this Congress. He was always a great supporter of IAH, and he would have been delighted that a lecture in his memory would be focusing on young people, but more importantly, would be given by a young person. He was a great believer in young people, both in terms of listening to them and having them involved with finding out. He was a pioneer of the narrative research technique, and also in terms of doing. So, Dakshita, please come and take a seat here. Dakshita Wickramatne is Sri Lankan by birth. He's a young researcher, activist, development practitioner, focusing on adolescent health, gender equality, and youth engagement. He has more than 8 years of extensive experience as a youth volunteer and a master trainer in working with most at-risk and vulnerable populations across the Asia and Pacific region. He's the co-founder of Youth Advocacy Network Sri Lanka, formerly known as YPeer Sri Lanka, working to establish youth-led accountability mechanisms. He currently serves as a commissioner in the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Well-being, and is a member of the Every Woman, Every Child Independent Accountability Panel appointed by the UN Secretary General. He previously served as a youth advisor to the UN Women's Global Civil Society Advisory Group, is a Woman Deliver Young Leader, and was appointed as the official Sri Lankan youth delegate to the Commonwealth by the government of Sri Lanka in 2015. Dakshita has a bachelor's degree in social work, a postgraduate diploma in diplomacy and global affairs, and a master's in development studies. He's worked for UNFPA Sri Lanka. He was the youngest assistant director to work for the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation in Sri Lanka, and he currently works as the Regional Advocacy Manager, Asia, for CARE International. Dakshita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Makes me feel like I'm not a young person anymore. Good morning, everyone. Namaste and Ayubovan. And that's how we greet people in Sri Lanka. And I'm sure all of you are having a really good time in the 11th World Congress on Adolescent Health in New Delhi. And I deem it a privilege, actually, to be able to deliver this keynote for you today. First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank the government of India, particularly the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, for hosting this remarkable meeting. I'm sure the steps taken by your government in promoting adolescent health and well-being have inspired the whole South Asian region, the region where I'm coming from, if not for the whole world. I'd also like to recognize the International Association for Adolescent Health in giving leadership and creating these mutually helpful opportunities, which are actually fruitful learning opportunities for all stakeholders involved in working on adolescent health and well-being, to make sure that these opportunities will uplift the health and lives of young people and adolescents across the globe. As it was previously mentioned, today I'm honored to deliver this keynote in memory of Dr. Herb Friedman, a leading proponent of adolescent health. However, I have to be honest, I haven't had the privilege of associating Dr. Friedman. In fact, I was just 10 years old when he passed away in the year 2000. But I have still been lucky to associate people who were inspired by the work and commitment of Dr. Friedman, and I was able to read many briefs and commentaries about him. In fact, one editorial written by Dr. Robert Blum and my dear friend Dr. Jane Ferguson has moved my heart and soul. I cannot do any fairness to the work of late Dr. Herb Friedman, but I'll at least try to do some justice by reading these few lines before I start my keynote. In the past 2 decades, there are many reasons and forces for the increased attention given to adolescents, but such forces in themselves would not have put adolescent health and development on the international agenda. Rather, it was these forces coupled with the dedication and skill of a smaller number of world leaders who made it happen. One such individual was Herbert Lloyd Friedman. The footprints of Dr. Herb's work are seen in the towns, villages, and capital cities of the world's nations. The world is a better, or at least a healthier place for young people today than a decade ago, not only because of globally negotiated documents in and of themselves, but because of those like Dr. Herb Friedman, who have provided us with such inspiration to guide our work. We are still striving to actualize his vision of harnessing the force of adolescents for themselves and for their societies. With that note, let me start sharing my thoughts on young people changing the future of adolescent health across the globe. I believe that young people and adolescents are the future of society, but they are also very much its present. They are not just leaders of tomorrow, but they are leaders of today. As evidence from statistics and experience show, adolescents who are healthy and are happy are better equipped to contribute to their communities as young citizens, despite the major shifts occurring in the world they are about to inherit. Adolescence is a dynamic concept that is being defined even now within the context of a life course approach to health and development. They are a diverse group of people, all experiencing numerous life changes, physical, mental, and social, that will affect their health and well-being for the rest of their lives. Given these differences, it's imperative to note that the markers of international recognition of the importance of adolescent and youth health exist nonetheless. For an example, commitments made by the World Health Assembly in Geneva in 1989 were reinforced by the specific recommendations of the International Conference on Population and Development, frequently referred as the Cairo 1994, which in turn contributed to the gender-specific achievements of the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, Beijing 1995. As a consequence, the international community has become increasingly inclined to identify adolescents as a distinct group for public health attention and as one in need of ad hoc, gender-sensitive reproductive health programs, education, counseling, and services provided within a framework of respect for their rights and responsibilities as individuals, partners, spouses, and parents, as well as members of families and communities and nations. Sadly, at present, the bitter truth is that almost 3,000 adolescents die every day. Top 5 causes being road traffic accidents, pneumonia, suicide, diarrheal diseases, and drowning. Nearly all these deaths are being preventable. Moreover, studies of health inequality show that the adolescent population is very much affected by the social divisions in society. Young people living in poverty and deprivation have poor health and have particular needs in terms of service delivery. Unfortunately, these young people and adolescents who need healthcare the most are the ones who have the least access to it. There is also a discourse about risk-taking. Still, we talk about adolescent health. We have this discourse about risk-taking. Many professionals have often taken a gloomy view, sadly, of adolescent health. Substance misuse, binge drinking, suicidal behaviors, road traffic accidents, sexually transmitted infections, and other so-called risky behaviors to illustrate that the current generation of youth and adolescents has no regard for health and healthy living. It is of paramount importance to understand this universal truth that taking risks is mostly a part of a learning process for adolescents and young people. Without experiencing health behaviors that involve risk, I think adolescent and young people cannot develop notions of what is safe and healthy for them. If all behaviors that have potential risk for health were to be avoided, then adolescents would not be able to learn how to manage challenges and overcome these obstacles. Amidst all these challenges, young people across the globe are changing the future of adolescent health. And I'd like to capture these changes under 3 pillars: actions, commitments, and transformation. Or, as #ACT in urban millennial slang. So let's get into actions. Speaking from the Sri Lankan experience, I first started working on adolescent health and youth health as a volunteer of Family Planning Association Sri Lanka in 2011. Little did I know how challenging and politically sensitive this field is. The important aspects of adolescent health and well-being are mainly considered to be the taboo in many societies in the global south, including Sri Lanka. There was, and still is, the question of negative stereotyping or the demonization of youth. As I have seen, this has a profound influence on how adolescent health is understood by the adult world. It also has a critical influence on how services are organized and delivered. At a time where governments are struggling to break these stereotypes, young people back in Sri Lanka were quite successful in using some innovative approaches to build a national dialogue on adolescent sexual and reproductive health through a national level debate competition, which reached out to more than 800 young people and engaged almost 30 national and local policy makers, including the parliamentarians, in 2011. Moreover, Road to Adulthood, which is also known as CyberPeer, which is an initiative of YPeer International with the support of United Nations Population Fund. We in Sri Lanka found the first ever computer-based learning tool on sexual and reproductive health, developed in partnership with the University of Sri Javadharpura, one of the main universities in Sri Lanka. And this tool is being piloted by 15 universities right now in Sri Lanka with the approval of the Ministry of Higher Education and the University Grants Commission. Another innovative action young people have taken in Sri Lanka is with people living with hearing disabilities. Official statistics estimate the population of people living with hearing disabilities in Sri Lanka to be more than 300,000. Furthermore, the National Policy on Disabilities has accepted that sign language more often than not is the only language of communication for people with hearing disabilities. But sadly, given that sexual and reproductive health and rights is a taboo topic in Sri Lanka, imagine the challenges people with hearing disabilities would face communicating to each other, expressing themselves, and trying to recognize their rights. So what these young people did was actually, when they understood there's an issue, they worked with the Center for Disability, the Ministry of Social Services, and trained sign language interpreters in terms of developing their skills, because they worked as the mediators between people with hearing disabilities and the service providers. And in fact, later on they developed a toolkit called We Hear You, which had specific signs for sexual and reproductive health and rights terms. And with this sign language glossary, now the government will introduce a sign language bill to recognize sign language as an official language in Sri Lanka. The minister had pointed out that official recognition of the sign language will allow a person with hearing disability to access education and have government services delivered to them without any discrimination and challenges. So these are youth-led activities taken by the young people in Sri Lanka. But I should also recognize the fact that young people in Sri Lanka are not the only ones who have been turning the tides. There are young people across the globe who's doing that. In fact, I can name a few people, but there's a lot. Tansila Khan from Pakistan, a young woman living with disability who's an inspirational speaker, and she's a public figure now. More than 300,000 young girls and adolescents are following her. There's Oko Arma Francis from Ghana, who should be sitting somewhere. I'm sorry, Oko, I can't find you right now. And there's Shanshang Li from China. And they are young people in Ghana and in China who are working as peer educators, as youth advocates, pushing the governments to have more progressive policies in their countries. And the list would go on. And these are just three of many who are turning the tides across the globe amidst social, economic, and even physical barriers. So let's get into commitments. The voices of young people are already influencing the policies, as I mentioned before. This may be where young people are asked about service delivery, or where they are given an opportunity to state what they want from treatment, rather than have an adult view thrust upon them, especially with regard to policies on adolescent health. All the evidence shows that the more young people can be given a voice in health matters, the more they will engage with health and the more likely they are to pursue a healthy lifestyle. Many youth-led and youth-serving organizations have challenged adult-led organizations in the health field to ask themselves to what extent they were listening to young people in their work. For me personally, the Family Planning Association Sri Lanka and International Planned Parenthood Federation was one of the best examples. If not for these organizations, I wouldn't be here today. In fact, IPPF has a global standard, I'd say, to have at least 50% of people at the governance levels to be young people, and more than 60% of them to be young girls. And this has been practiced in most of the national family planning associations. As I said, regionally, because the Asia-Pacific region is closer to me, I should definitely mention some of the organizations who are engaged in making sure that the government will honor the commitments they have made. So, for an example, the UNFPA's initiative of VIPEA, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, and also in the Middle East and North African region and the Eastern European region, are doing a massive job in terms of reaching out to adolescents and young people in schools and also out school, providing peer education services and information. Asia's Safe Abortion Partnership's Youth Champions Initiative should be recognized, with supporting young people, especially young women and girls, to lobby for this, to have more progressive laws on safe abortion across Asia and the Pacific. Youth Lead and Youth Voices Count are key youth-led organizations working in Asia for the rights of young key populations of HIV, including young people living with HIV, young drug users, young sex workers, and young men who have sex with men. Many more organizations globally, including Women Deliver, PMNCH, Plan International, are doing this job. And to look at the national level commitments, I should again recognize the Rashtriya Kishore Swasthya Karakam program, frequently known as RKSK of India, to be a great example of government taking the leadership and honoring their commitments. The program envisions enabling all adolescents in India to realize their full potential by making informed decisions. Now, this is actually the good side of commitments, but I think I should get into some of the challenges faced by young people across the whole world in terms of holding the governments to account. For an example, the conversation on comprehensive sexuality education has been there since, I guess, 1994, but still, most countries are still struggling to have comprehensive sexuality education in their schools. I just have one statement to say about that. I think comprehensive sexual education or life, I think WHO uses a different term, I'm not familiar with that, life education, whatever it is, CSC has to be in schools, period. There's no discussion about that, because sexual education is not just about teaching young people about their sexual organs or reproductive system, but it's all about respecting each other, understanding this diversity, and giving them this sense of empowerment to make decisions over their bodies and their lives. Also, punitive laws across Asia still prevails, which actually restricts young women and girls from seeking safe abortion, but also which restricts people with different sexual orientations and gender identity and people living with disabilities. In fact, there's a threat to many young people across the globe who work as advocates and activists, especially with certain restrictions of particular governments with regard to their safety and security. In fact, many young people I know have been put into prisons, or their work has been stopped, the organizations have been closely monitored. And also, it's important to note that some governments in Asia, sadly, have really restrictive laws and policies that, in fact, for an example, people using drugs have been killed. Especially recently, there's a Southeast Asian country where a young adolescent of 17 years old was shot dead. Still, under all these difficult and challenging environments, young people are fighting for equality and trying to hold their governments to account. And my final point on commitments is actually on outcome statements of these meetings. I believe that there has been a lot of outcome statements, many agreements, and I particularly think take these meetings as yes chambers, because all of us agree to deliver, and I think the conversation needs to go beyond this particular room. And for us to do that, the best way is to use these outcome statements, but to make sure that we will honor these commitments and not just make it just another document, but to use it as something which we can use to influence policies. And I'm sure young people here today in this particular meeting will be also presenting an outcome statement, and I'm sure they'll be doing their best to deliver it, and I expect all the other stakeholders to honor their commitments to these statements as well. And can I get a yes to that? So this is a slide I was thinking of using for advocacy, but I missed it. It's okay. So the final point is about transformation. The discussion on youth voice has clear links to notions of participation and empowerment. The more young people believe that their voice is being heard, the more empowered they will feel. However, I believe that young people can participate without feeling empowered. And indeed, they can and must be allowed to speak without anyone taking any notice of what they say. For this reason, it is as much the quality and intention of the involvement of young people that makes the difference, rather than the formal arrangements established by the adults involved. There are many types of participation, ranging from the tokenistic to the fully engaged and involved, as has been well rehearsed in the discussions about Hart's ladder of participation. It goes without saying that the greater degree of genuine participation, the better it will be for the health of young people. I will, in fact, not do justice to my feelings if I do not share my observations on the current trends of youth participation globally as someone who has been an activist and a youth advocate for more than 8 years. We must recognize the diversity of professional and career goals and needs of all youth advocates. I feel that there are general assumptions made on youth participation which may not be the case. We have to understand that every youth advocate might not want to become or have desires to become global envoys on youth or winners of these flashy awards and titles. I have seen and I know that some would remain at the grassroots level in their villages, focusing only on uplifting their families and communities. That is the transformation they'd like to see, not to pursue some of these flamboyant titles. I think this trend has created some unhealthy competition between young people engaged in development, and it can actually do more harm to the field of youth advocacy than benefiting it. So in conclusion, it is essential that policymakers and practitioners seek to address the negative stereotypes whenever possible and ensure in their work that the stereotypes are challenged so that a positive, strengths-based approach can be taken at all times. Adolescents and youth are actually at a stage at a time of gradually increasing their autonomy when it is essential that young people start to take responsibility for their own health. And this needs to be properly understood by the adult professionals. And they should also be trained to recognize that adolescence is a stage and that it has particular characteristics that should inform the health services, health interventions, and health promotion. To achieve this, it would represent a significant step towards better health provision for all young people. And it should also be noted that the changing digital and technological environment should be taken into consideration. There were moments where initiatives or harmful initiatives like Blue Whale were actually harming young people than actually young people being able to reap the benefits of social and digital media. Moreover, as a member of the Independent Accountability Panel appointed by the UN Secretary General, I must say, investing in accountability per se, what it takes to get to meaningful accountability processes, to nurture virtuous circles of accountability, is part of the accountability gap. Hence, we need more investments in civil society, especially in youth-led organizations, in social accountability, in independent evidence-based capacities to effectively engage in decision-making with ministries of health and of finance and to impact for change. This takes leadership from government, from the UN system, and from the civil society itself to make this new global strategy and the sustainable development goals an even bigger game changer than the first for the health and human rights of all. From actions to commitments, which leads to transformation. And with all that I have shared, I'd like to end this with a question. Young people across the world are already acting to uplift not only their health and well-being, but of their families and communities. The question is, can you actually keep up with them? Thank you.
Okay, Dakshita, thank you so much for your inspiring presentation, and I hope over the next 2 days we bear in mind the hashtag ACT in all the discussions that we have. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand over to my co-chair, Anupam Sachdeva, the incoming president of the Indian Academy of Pediatrics. Anupam.
Thank you very much, sir. I have the pleasure of introducing Kate Gilmore. May I request Kate Gilmore to please come onto the stage? Kate has been the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights for the last 2 years. She has diverse and long-standing experience in strategic leadership and human rights advocacy with the United Nations, governmental and non-governmental organizations. Prior to joining her position, she was Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director for the program with the United Nations Population Fund. Previously, she was National Director of Amnesty International Australia and then Executive Deputy Secretary General of Amnesty International. Kate started her career as a social worker and government policy officer in Australia. She helped establish Australia's first centre against sexual assault at Melbourne's Royal Women's Hospital, and her work over a number of years focused on prevention of violence against women. In Australia, she was granted honorary appointments to provincial and national policy, public policy and law reforms processes, including membership of the country's first National Committee on Violence Against Women. I think one can't have a more eminent personality to talk about migration. Thank you, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be here, and I'd like to thank the International Association for Adolescent Health for the opportunity to join you at the 11th World Congress, and congratulate to the Government of India for their hosting of this, in particular the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and overall congratulate the organising committee and yourselves for being so wise as to take advantage of this unique opportunity. When we consider that the population of adolescents globally is at its highest level ever, if we factor in where it is those young people are most concentrated, if we examine how current policy and practice are treating them, and if we look out onto the world that we are bequeathing to them, then the urgency of acting more decisively, more conclusively right now becomes clear. Acting now to ensure this enormous reserve of potential is not denied its contribution, but is enabled to emerge into the flow of our world's challenges as influential, powerful actors of positive change. And our need to direct change positively has never been greater, for we are the first generation that can choose to be the last. We stand today in the midst of unprecedented opportunity and almost unfathomable challenge. By any number of measures, globally, there is a massive dynamic of change underway, unprecedented in scale, in significance, in consequence, in pace, and in impact. Friends, this is an unprecedented now. Conflict, contagion, climate instability, the cruel twin crises of feud and famine. These are the dynamics shaping harsh realities for unprecedented numbers of people, and those countries suffering the gravest of these impacts have the youngest of populations. The city unplanned, the sprawling slum, contaminated water supplies and insecure food chains, rising armed conflict, deepening corruption, eroding peace. But on the other hand, people more interconnected than ever before. 40% of us now have access to the internet. 20 years ago, it was less than 1%. And while the greatest increase in access to the internet is in some of the poorest places, information poverty is entrenching poverty of opportunity, of bigotry, and of prejudice. Consumption at more than twice the rate at which this planet can replenish itself. Driving instability, driving destabilising shifts in climate, while with graver inequality within and between countries, graver than at any other time in human history, it is predicted that this year, 1% of the world's population will now own more wealth than all the other 99% combined. And in the meantime, a misanthropic, malicious rollback on hard-won health gains for women and girls is in play, with ramped-up attempts to erode sexual and reproductive health and rights, bringing selective, discriminatory and devastating consequences for women, adolescents and the newborn, exacting on them unaffordable costs, also for their families and their communities. Indeed, people's access to quality health services and information without fear, without stigma or discrimination is under grave threat. Deliberate and punitive targeting of health workers and health facilities, particularly, but not only, in conflict settings, is on the increase. In this world, thanks to the extraordinary development gains of the past decades, more people are living longer. We are about, for the first time in human history, to have the number of adults aged 65 and over outnumber children under the age of 5. But 40% of this world's population is under the age of 25, more educated, more politically active. If youth were a nationality, if being an adolescent were an ethnicity, then theirs would be a country the size of India itself. Friends, these are the dynamics of shifting power and powerlessness that makes today an unprecedented now, a unique moment, which if we lose will mean otherwise preventable suffering, sorrow and indignity for generations to come. A burden that may not be borne by us directly, perhaps, but a burden that most certainly will bend the backs of our children and of our children's children. Perhaps the most telling sign that we hover on the brink of opportunity lost, that we're paying a high price for man-made disaster and man-made inequality, is that now there are also more people on the move than ever before in human history. The unprecedented change dynamics that we observe the world over are also driving people out of their homes, out of their livelihoods and at record levels, with more fleeing to relief from the unbearable and journeying on in the hope of the promising. We have the largest number of refugees since the height of refugee movement in World War II. And it is estimated that around 70% of the world's people on the move internally are women and those under age of 18. 12% of the world's 15 to 24-year-olds are migrating across borders, with children making up perhaps more than a third of those taking perilous journeys across the sea into Europe, and accounting for at least 30% of recorded deaths. Ladies and gentlemen, adolescents are on the move. They are asylum seekers fleeing conflict, violence and persecution. They are people compelled to move to escape extreme poverty and lack of access to land, to food, to water, to decent work, education and healthcare. They move because, separated from their families, perhaps who had migrated many years before, they journeyed to be reunited. And they move to escape the consequences of environmental degradation and climate change. They leave, they travel. They aim for a new world, for many of the same reasons that you and I also moved, travelled, explored, and for the same reasons that our forefathers and mothers travelled and explored since time began. But today we see so much migration is precarious. Along irregular migratory routes, that movement is rarely voluntary. Women, men, boys and girls put their lives at risk with long and brutal journeys across inhospitable deserts and on the high seas because they feel they have little other choice. It is the policies of governments, the lack of regular migration pathways, the militarisation of borders and the criminalisation of irregular migration that are pushing more and more people to undertake more and more perilous journeys. And at each and every stage of that migration journey, a person's age, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, health and disability shape their outcomes. For adolescents, it's characterised by multiple threats of xenophobia, of discrimination, of physical harm, psychological trauma, of sexual and economic exploitation. And when at the world's borders they stand, they are subjected to raids and to detention. Although threat accompanies them wherever they go, opportunities do not. While risks to their health and well-being travel relentlessly with them, relief, services and support, it seems not. As the distance from the cause of their flight lengthens, the distance to their point of arrival in a place of dignity and acceptance more often does too. For in transit, migrant adolescents are met with violence, with kidnapping, abduction and extortion. They are the victims of human trafficking, of sexual exploitation, of child labour, and of criminal and illegal activity. Particularly when travelling in an irregular manner, children are at risk of violence at both the hands of the state and non-state actors, and they're at risk of witnessing heinous violence directed against their parents or others. Reporting earlier this week to the United Nations General Assembly, an independent expert known as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Life and Extrajudicial Killings, she advised the world's governments that so perilous are these migratory routes that they amount to a human rights and humanitarian crisis, which are characterised by mass casualties globally, a regime of impunity for perpetrators, and a high tolerance by governments for fatality. Deaths of refugees and migrants often remain undocumented. How many have been executed, shot, left to drown, we do not know. How many have lost their lives to starvation or dehydration, we do not know. How many have been tortured, denied life-saving treatment, or died from despair, we simply do not know. That was her chilling message to the United Nations General Assembly. These migratory boys and girls, those who survive the journeys, then arrive at their destination profoundly traumatised by what they've been through. But migration governance, policy and practice, is centred more on the protection of borders than on the protection of people. Many of our current migration policies and practices not only fail to respond to the trauma of those on the move, they actually exacerbate it. A variety of harmful measures are in place: punitive border control measures, criminalisation of irregular migration, and unbelievably mandatory detention. You know, mandatory detention of migrants is widespread. And under its practice, instead of being protected, migrant adolescents are deprived of their liberty. You know, there's a reason why every penal code in the world uses deprivation of liberty as a common and serious punishment. We are not born to be locked up. And yet, the migrant young people that my colleagues have interviewed in migration centres across Europe keep asking us, why are they being treated as criminals? They describe how incredibly distressing it is to be closed up in dark and narrow spaces. They speak of how they are left feeling desperate, depressed, and sick physically, of how they are left merely to dream of sun and fresh air and blue skies. The Special Rapporteur on Torture has stated the deprivation of liberty of children within the context of administrative immigration enforcement is never in the best interest of the child. It exceeds the requirement of necessity, becomes grossly disproportionate, and may constitute cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment of migrant children. Friends, child and family immigration detention should be prohibited. Should be prohibited in law, and its abolishment urgently pursued in policy and practice. You know, having experienced severe trauma and emotional distress, migrant boys and girls are often left with urgent mental health needs. But due to inadequate screening, insufficient access to skilled staff, rarely is this identified or addressed. And that's particularly the case for the many, many, many who are subjected to sexual and gender-based violence along their journey. Experts, including child protection officers, must be present at borders to complete human rights-based screening and make appropriate referrals. Migrant adolescents should have access to specific care and psychological support, to comprehensive rights-based sexual and reproductive health information and services, and there must be specialised care for those surviving sexual violence. Psychological support for migrants who have lost family members, for migrant women who have suffered miscarriages or other adverse pregnancy outcomes must be guaranteed. Yet on arrival, more often than not, migrants are denied access to essential services, to education, to housing, to healthcare. They're excluded from recreation, from participation, from social security. Even when their rights to services are protected in law, they face administrative and other obstacles impeding their access. Inflexible demands for identity documents, harmful and inaccurate age determination procedures, financial and linguistic barriers, the risk that using even essential services will reveal their status and result in detention or deportation. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has made clear that migrants' enjoyment of the right to health without discrimination must not depend on the legal status of the person concerned. In particular, migrant boys and girls and their families must be able to access health services without fear of being detected, detained and deported. And it's essential we put in place firewalls to separate immigration enforcement activity from public health service provision. Healthcare institutions must be prohibited from reporting data on the legal status of their patients to immigration authorities. Healthcare providers must be clearly informed that they are not required to do so, and migrants must be given specific assurances that they will not be reported to immigration if they seek healthcare. Instead, the healthcare migrant adolescents receive should be age-sensitive, appropriate, culturally, linguistically tailored. Timely and accurate information on health and health rights should be made available at all stages of their journey, along migratory routes, at reception centres and in communities where they settle, live and work. and training initiatives and community awareness campaigns about these realities should be made available to ensure health professionals are informed and understand the specific experience of migrant adolescents. And states must provide for systematic efforts to sensitise and build the capacity of health personnel to promote those rights. Friends, you know, money can travel the globe virtually without restriction. It's okay for money to search out more favourable conditions in which to flourish. It's fine for money to go seeking for more beneficial, conducive labour conditions. How is it that people do not have the same opportunity as money? You know, nation-states are a relatively new idea, but migration is as old as humanity. Shouldn't people have the same opportunity? You know, since time immemorial, people have been on the move. It's thanks to people's movement across and within borders that we have discovered, we've created, we've learned, we've invented, we've traded. Borders, by contrast, seek to regulate and restrict this age-old human custom, and do so for the distinct purpose of excluding some and privileging others, discriminating between people to discriminate against some people. As has been said, they do not simply set boundaries for countries. Borders are metaphors for the boundaries of how we think about other human beings. Immigrants are not the problem. Borders are. And today they are reinforcing age-based privilege and age-based disadvantage. In the midst of unprecedented world change, and despite poor policy choices, we nevertheless do know, more or less, what we should do. We do know, more or less, how to make this world work for the better. Not just for some of us, but for each of us. As we've heard, a meeting of all governments set out the formula for the action plan for a just and peaceful and sustainable world when they agreed to 17 goals, which are part of what is now known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It's an action plan, an operational plan for people, the planet, for peace and prosperity. And it pledges to leave no one behind. No one. So, frankly, we know why change is inevitable. We know what must be done to make these changes amount to something positive. We know how to go about managing those changes. The SDGs tell us. I believe there is something missing. Why, what, how? What's missing is the question of who. Just by sheer scale, in this century, age will join gender and ethnicity as the pivotal identities. How we interact this century with age will determine in which direction moves the future of planet peace, prosperity and people. But buried under this new reality is a new inequality, age-based inequality, not merely age-old discrimination. And it's this inequality that is at the heart of today's patterns of migration. After all, 90% of the world's adolescents are living in low-income countries from where a majority of the world's irregular migration come. 90% of those who are aged and aging further are living in high-income countries, countries of destination, the source of some of the most malicious migration policies we see today. The median age of Niger and Uganda, 15. Of South Sudan, of Central Africa Republic, of Somalia, of Yemen, the places of conflict, 17, 18, 19. The median age of privilege, Japan, 47. Germany, 45. And the median age of parliamentarians, 53. Friends, youth is poor. It's subjected to the gravest of insecurity. It's on the front lines of conflict. It's populating the roads of escape. It's locked in the back rooms of neglect. It's kept outside the rooms in which decisions made affecting them are taken. If we want, and goodness me knows, we need to effect positive change, we have to dismantle this exclusion. As Einstein said, you cannot solve your problems with the same thinking you used to create them. We cannot solve these problems with the same thinkers. We have to bring in new thinkers, different ones, younger ones. You know, adolescents are always on the move. They're on a journey from childhood to adulthood. No wonder, when needed, they seek refuge in safer neighbourhoods. This is more a question of rights than it is a question of migration alone. Rights, they're just a binding definition of what it means to be human. Medical science codifies anatomy, physiology, or musculature. Human rights, they give us internationally defined definitions of how we are all precious, unique and equal. Human rights doesn't prevent our diversity, they protect it. Doesn't limit our diverse expression, they ensure it. Doesn't restrict our access to culture or belief or opinion, they guarantee it. And however desperate, being on the move does not and cannot erase your rights. People on the move, like people who have no movement, have human rights, inalienable, universal. And the opposite of human rights upheld, selfishness, bullying, bigotry, injustice, tyranny, oppression, toxic stepping stones, a perverse paving of pathways to privation, to suffering, and ultimately atrocity. Contempt for the other, hatred of the foreigner, distrust of those who look or love or worship differently, aided and abetted today by clampdowns on freedom of the press, stepped up surveillance in cyberspace, encroachment on public movement, closure of national borders to people fleeing persecution, gagging of activists, the deprivation even of life-saving services such as those essential for sexual and reproductive health. The pounding of these malicious fists grow louder and louder on the doors of our dignity, our privacy, our mental and physical integrity, and against our freedom, and this must be resisted. You know, we know only too well where this toxic path leads. Humanity has travelled down that path before. It leads to a dead end, to death-ridden ends. And in this struggle against exclusion and against bigotry, I'm sorry, there's no north or south, there's no right or left, there's neither east nor west, there is only the humane and the inhumane. And in this world, it's a fallacy that borders, walls and fences erode our obligations to each other's rights. Walls within the human family on a small, distressed planet in a globalised world, home to the largest population of the youngest people in all of human history, walls are untruths. There is no country on this planet at this time in this interconnected world that can rightfully stand apart, bury its head or absent itself from the global table of rights-filled solutions. You know, in Nicaragua, once I sat down with a 14-year-old girl to listen to her story. She had a baby on her lap and a child of 3 at her knee. The baby's father, her boyfriend, was no longer living with her. He had become violent, and she had taken her children on a long and perilous journey away from home and family and friends, seeking safety. Staying temporarily in a youth shelter, she explained that her older boy, clearly hyperactive, was the product of rape at the hands of her uncle. She, at the age of 10, had sought a termination of that pregnancy, but the state denied it to her. Throughout our conversation, she cried. She was explaining too that once she had dared to hope to stay in school and she had dreamt of being a nurse. It was just so painful to both listen to her story and for her to tell it. I asked her why was she taking that care. She explained she was speaking to me because she believed that people like us can make a difference so that other girls need not go through what she went through. You may not believe in you, and at times you likely won't, but she believed in you. And young people, this is where you come in, and we oldies must let you in to take the dynamics of this interdependent, interconnected world of change and twist and turn them so that opportunities are maximised and threats minimised, so that preventable suffering is eliminated, so that hate is never the basis of public or private action, so that the ecology of our planet is rescued from our greed, so that innovation in technology, science, philosophy, art, literature, music can involve us into greater compassion, greater humility, and a less self-first approach to daily and global action. And for this we must invest in young people, pave their way, dismantle the barriers that block their way, and then get out of their way. For we may not have left a better world behind for our children, but we can and we must leave better youth, better men and women for the world they have. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that was a brilliant talk, a very passionate talk, and shows her commitment towards her purpose. Thank you very much, Kate, for enlightening us and for bringing us to speed. I think we'll close down this session with this talk, and I request the organizers to please take over the stage. Thank you. I think she deserves a standing ovation.
Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. What an inspiring and passionate session that was. And yes, it makes us think that, we don't have to make this world a better place for some, but yes, for everyone. And one thing that we can do is act, commit, and transform. So, ladies and gentlemen, after this inspiring session and hearing experts, let's take this further. Our next session is on early adolescent health and development in low and middle income countries. And I would request Kate Bayston, International Youth Alliance and Family Planning USA, to please join me on stage. With that, I would also request Tamara Krenin, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation USA, to please join me on stage for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the plenary session on early adolescent health and development in low-resource settings. We have with us here experts who are doing an incredible work with a focus on very young adolescents, and we'll be discussing new contributions to the understanding of early adolescent health, development, internationally, and with a focus on programs, policies, and services. First, we are going to hear about the everyday lives of young adolescents and findings from Young Lives by Dr. Jo Boyden, who is right here to my left. And she is a social anthropologist and has spent over 30 years undertaking research with children, adolescents, and youth in situations of adversity all over the world. And most recently, focusing on young people exposed to armed conflict, forced migration, and poverty. Her objectives for the Young Life study is to focus on research for policy and program design, aimed at enhancing young people's well-being and development. After that, we would have an opportunity to hear from Professor Robert Blum, who has attended every International Association for Adults and Health conference since 1979. And that was in Washington, D.C., when his now 40-year-old son slept on the floor next to him when he was 2 years old while he spoke. Professor Blum's international work began in 1987 when he was on sabbatical at WHO at the recommendation of David Bennett, who had spent some time there 2 years ago. The first paper he ever wrote on adults and health globally was at the urging of Dale Garrow, one of the first-generation leaders of the Society for Adults in Health and Medicine. After that, Dr. Rajib is going to give us a view of India on adolescent health. Dr. Rajib works for the Population Council, and his areas of work include youth and adolescents, early marriage, maternal health in general, and abortion in particular. He loves photography, is a mountain trekker, and he has an adolescent son, so he is very close connection with adolescent health issues. Because of his long-standing interest in an early adolescent, he is here to share his experiences with us today. Thank you. Dr. Joy Borden.
Good morning, everybody. I want to talk about what I feel are the most important ways of understanding and seeing adolescent lives and how these might impact their health. We all know what the major challenges are in adolescent health. They're lagging behind all others in progress. Adolescence is when so many of the major health problems of adulthood arise. Yet they're very low in policy priorities, and also they're the least likely to access health services. My central argument is that we need a far better understanding of their daily lives in order to explain what is going on in terms of these challenges. So I'm going to draw on some evidence from Young Lives, the study that I direct. We've been following 12,000 children in Ethiopia, in India, Peru and Vietnam since 2002. We've conducted 5 survey rounds and 4 waves of qualitative research in this time. The study is a study of child poverty and the outcomes of early experiences of poverty. We have an equal number of boys and girls in the sample, and we have 2 age cohorts. And that's very important because we're interviewing the younger ones at the same age as the older ones, which enables us to see some of the trends and changes over time in the environments in which these young people live. We take a bioecological life course perspective, and this means that we're very focused on the early circumstances and how these shape adolescent outcomes. We have an integrated view of children's development, well-being, and health, and we understand the importance of the synergies between the different aspects of their development, the ways in which physical nutrition, physical health, for example, influence psychosocial well-being. And we are very focused on the socioeconomic and cultural determinants of health, and therefore we pay a great deal of attention to context. So I want to start by really reinforcing the incredible importance of early childhood. I mean, this is well established, but it's almost become an orthodoxy, I think, that detracts from the importance of adolescence, certainly in the health field, but also in developmental psychology and in many other disciplines as well. So here we have the prevalence of stunting in the Young Lives sample at ages 1, 5, 8, 12, and 15 in each of our study countries. And you will see that starting in early childhood, children who are stunted, that you then see a very strong persistence of high rates of stunting, with boys more likely to be stunted than girls. Yet, one of the things that our study has found is there's considerable recovery and faltering in growth through adolescence. So this is a highly dynamic situation, not, as we would have been led to believe in the past, that once you've passed the first 1,000 days of life, in a sense, if you're stunted, the cause is already lost for you. So we find that a significant number of our young people have actually recovered, and a significant number also who were not stunted have fallen into stunting. And the reason why this matters is because we can see that stunting is predictive of many aspects of children's lives. Stunting at age 8 is predictive of self-efficacy, self-esteem, and aspirations at age 12. And those who recovered by 15 had better cognitive test scores than those who remained stunted. So the really important point here is that early adolescence is therefore a dynamic and incredible critical moment of transition and a window of opportunity for policy. However, I think I would argue that we have very little systematic policy engagement with adolescents. Beyond the health field, health actually invented the concept of adolescence. It doesn't actually resonate in many other disciplines where research is being conducted. People talk about early, middle, and late childhood and youth, but not so much about adolescence. So we really need to raise the profile of this critical moment in the life course. I would also argue, though, that we lack knowledge, tools, and platforms for effective prevention. We do a lot of work with young people themselves, for instance, and not so much with their families and their communities. The resistors, the detractors, the people, the abusers and the exploiters often of children and young people. I just wanted to give a couple of examples from our data of ways in which adolescent health doesn't always threaten young people in ways that policy imagines. There's a very strong focus in the health community on risk behaviors, risk-taking, sexual reproductive health, and similar behavioral aspects of adolescent health. And yet we found that these risk behaviors were so marginal in the lives of the 15-year-olds, we didn't continue with this work. We decided that this was not actually a productive area for research. However, we do find new health morbidities that have risen dramatically in our samples across the 4 countries. And perhaps many of you will be not at all surprised to realize that overweight and obesity is dramatically rising across the 2 samples. We can see how many more of the younger ones are facing these problems than were the older ones. But also we see it rising over the life course, including during early adolescence. So my main point is that young adolescents often lead complicated, demanding, and unhealthy lives. These everyday realities are really important for shaping their health outcomes, not only in adolescence, but for in adulthood as well. So just starting with the daily time use, if you like, of young adolescents at the age of 12, we have nearly universal enrollment in education across the sample. That was an enormous surprise to us, especially in Ethiopia, which is a particularly poor country. Educational aspirations are extraordinarily high, and families make incredible sacrifices for their children to attend, including selling land, including getting into debt in order for their children to go to school. But education performance, learning outcomes are abysmal. The quality of education that most of the children in our sample receive is really, really poor. And this is particularly the case for boys, except in India, where there is a systematic bias against girls. In the other context, boys are struggling at school. And I notice that in the health community, people often talk about school as being the platform, the most obvious platform for young adolescents to access for their health information, health knowledge, and programs. But actually, school can be a really distressing experience, not just because it's humiliating to repeat your grades and to fall behind your peers, but also because it's a very violent and hostile place. For girls, for example, going to school during menstruation is often impossible because there are no private toilets for them to attend. Corporal punishment and bullying are really pervasive phenomena in all of our contexts. And then I want to turn to work. I think the Western world tends to imagine that adolescence is a time free of responsibility when young people are all in school. Well, they aren't. They're in school part-time in the main, and when they're not in school, they are working very hard. And here you can see two examples from Ethiopia and Vietnam, where you can see that the amount of hours spent a day working rises over the course of adolescence. And of course, there's a big distinction based on gender between boys who do more paid work and girls who do more of the domestic work in the home. That's not a surprise. I think, though, that I want to highlight this combination of school, work, caring for sick family members. You know, most of our young people have responsibilities, not just towards younger siblings, but in contexts like Ethiopia, where adult health is so compromised by so many different conditions, they're often actually caring for their elderly parents, their grandparents, and indeed they're sometimes the primary breadwinners. So they struggle to meet both the immediate needs of their households as well as those incredibly high aspirations for the future. And those aspirations are not just for individual social mobility, but also the family rests all of its ambitions on the future of their children. So early departure from school, which is very common amongst the children who work, is a source of terrible shame and a terrible sense of stigma that follows. And those aspirations that were high when they were in early adolescence crash as they leave school. They repeat their grades, they fail their exam, they don't transition, and they realize that they're not going to realize their future hopes. And yet, we can't take work away from adolescents. It's really important as a learning vital gender skills, for labor market entry. It's a way you get the toe in the door, as it were, and also for contributing to households. So this is the reality of everyday lives for adolescents across many parts of the globe. And here you have a quote from one of the caregivers in Ethiopia who's talking about her 12-year-old son. And she's really proud that he's got a job. She's really proud that he's working in actually probably quite a hazardous occupation, because this is enabling him to learn skills for his future. So I just really want to reinforce this argument that poverty, risk, and responsibility are really important in shaping the trajectories of young people. And we can see how the multiple determinants of household poverty, environmental stresses, shocks, of individual struggles that young people face in going through school and so on, impact their outcomes. Predictors of secondary school completion and early marriage and parenting are already well established in early childhood. And we need to understand that this is a source of social injustice and inequality in many contexts, where young people are not able to get themselves out of this extraordinarily difficult situation they find themselves in. So just to finalize, I really wanted to emphasize some of the policy messages that I would like to convey from our evidence. We would argue that, yes, the first 1,000 days of life are absolutely critical. Of course, we must emphasize that. However, we've got to find ways of linking investment and policy across childhood and adolescence, and not just assume that young people are in school and in school they're catered for, because that's absolutely not the case. We need to have adolescent-sensitive social protection programs which enable young people to have more choices and to alleviate the pressures on their lives. Cash transfers and other programs have found to be very effective in many communities for taking some of the load off families and therefore off their young people as well. I really want to advocate for a holistic understanding of adolescent health, which goes beyond risk behaviors and much more towards competency and resilience. They are, in the main, extraordinarily competent young people. They take extraordinary responsibility. Let's not take away from that by making them victims and pathologizing their lives. School environments, we need to have real attention to sanitation, safety, and respect for young people, and not just focus on curriculum. We need to have much more attention to occupational health for young people, because they really are working very hard in often very dangerous conditions. And let's design interventions that actually match young adolescents' real lives. Thank you.
Rajiv, let me welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Bob. We just changed our slot a bit from what we planned for. I'm going to talk about early adolescent health, a view from India from a very freshly minted data set. Why I'm going to talk about it? Because there's no data. We know that the early adolescents constitute about half of all the all adolescents, but about 141 million in India are early adolescents. 30% of them are about 41 million live in two major states of India, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. This is, we know all this is a comparatively healthy period of life, although this is a period where there's a rapid individual transformation encompassing physical, social, emotional, and cognitive changes. Data, however, related to these adolescent health are very sparse, at least in India. So whatever programming we have been doing, we are programming in dark, actually. So we need to collect data, present data for programming and evaluation. In India, India has a long-standing commitment to adolescent, which was reinstated in 2014 by launching RKSK. All of you must have attended few sessions on it. Importantly, RKSK recognizes 10 to 14 as a separate group, a group that needs attention. It also aims to ensure universal coverage of health information and services for all adolescents, including 10 to 14. It spans 6 domains. From the traditional SRH, it's extended to mental health, injuries and violence, NCDs, and also substance use. Intervention at both community level and through peer educators and facility levels are actually planned. So I'm just going to look at my data set, our data set that we from POP Council we have just got. Examine the situation and needs of this group in 5 out of 6 domains stipulated by RKSK. We don't have data as yet on non-communicable diseases, but I'm sure after the CNNS National Nutrition Survey is out, we'll also have data on NCDs in this age group. I'm going to talk about the study that we have recently done, understanding the lives of adolescents and young adults. We very fondly call it Iaah. So one of its kind, it's first time the state representative evidence on situation and needs of adolescents in these 2 major states with a sample size over 20,000. Covers 2 states, as I said, rural and urban both, boys and girls, both age groups 10 to 14 and 15 to 19, also married and unmarried, married only for girls. For this presentation, I'm only using data for 10 to 14, it's about 3,300 in the 2 states together. This is a sample characteristics. They are very similar, boys and girls, perfectly balanced. Go one by one. First, sexual reproductive health practices. Look at menstrual hygiene. About 35% girls in our sample began menstruating. When we asked them what they use during menstruation, 51% said they use pieces of cloth, and only 32% said sanitary napkins. So we asked those who did not use sanitary napkin, why did not they use? The 3 major issues are here. They can't afford it, difficult to get, or feel shy to buy it from somewhere, do not know about sanitary napkin. Second, self-reported SRH problem. Significant minority of them reported so, particularly boys, 15% of them reported self-reported SRH problems. More boys than girls reported a problem. Treatment seeking, those who had a problem, we asked them whether they sought treatment or not, and about 66% boys versus 21% girls said they sought treatment. And the place they wanted, or the preferred place they wanted to go, or actually gone, is private facility or doctor. Coming to nutrition, we asked questions about their dietary practices. We also tested for anemia and also measured their height and weight. Looking at their daily dietary habits, you see most of them don't get proper diet. On an average, not more than 2 food groups are consumed by adolescents daily. Less than 1% had all food groups consumed every day. 5 to 8% had none of the food groups covered in their daily diets. The nutritional status, anemia, 55% of girls and 34% of boys had any anemia, 13 and 6% had severe anemia. Looking at stunting, 29% of boys and 19% of girls had thinness, severe thinness. If you look at the numbers, what it translates into numbers, we have a huge burden of anemia in these study states. About 6.6 million boys and 12 million girls are anemic in these 2 states alone. 1.2 and 2.8 million were severely anemic. Going to mental health, it's a new area. We asked questions that are tested, time tested, the PHQ 9. 9 questions were asked related to sleeping, eating, patterns, concentration, feeling of tension, depression during the last 2 weeks before the survey. Special training was provided to investigators to tackle this question, to ask this question properly by the experts in the field. The score ranges from 0 to 27. Also, in the last 12 months, whether they had a suicidal tendency, attempted to commit suicide, we asked of those who aged 13 and 14. Also asked questions on self-harm, on 3 dimensions of self-harm. Mental health condition, if you look at this, 38 and 45% boys and girls had mild depression related, sorry, not 38, 3.8 and 4.5% had mild depression related symptoms, and about 9.9% girls also had moderate to severe depression. If you look at suicidal tendency or self-harm, about 5 to 6% reported they ever attempted to harm themselves. Again, translating them into numbers, 2.4 million in last 1 year in these 2 states alone inflicted self-harm. 1.9 million showed some symptoms of depression. 0.4 million considered suicide. Looking at the injuries and violence, we also asked about whether they had a road injury or injury in any other ways, and about 34 and 20% reported they had an injury in the last 12 months. So 1/3 of boys and 1/5 of girls. They also face violence, violence at home, violence outside home. Violence at home, half of the boys and slightly less than that, 37% of the girls reported they are beaten by their parents in last 12 months. Violence outside home, similar proportion, they fought with somebody, about 46 and 30% of boys and girls reported so. 5th is the substance use. You know, about 4% of boys and 1% of girls reported that they used tobacco products in last 1 year. Alcohol, ever consumed this, and then last 1 year, 1 week in the last 1 month, about 2% of boys reported so. Whether they have program access, we talk about program there, we have programs for them. 33% girls knew about the sanitary napkin program. I talked about sanitary napkin in the beginning. Only about 10% receive benefits of it. Only 1% know about our flagship program, RKSK. About 1/4 of boys and girls received health services information at school. Almost everybody knew there was an Anganwadi worker in their village or area. 56 to 66% knew about the ASHA worker, but only 4 to 7% of them received any services or information from them. So in summary, although one perceives that early adolescence is a period of good health, there are serious health issues in this group. The burden of anemia and chronic malnutrition is huge. The ticking bomb of mental health problem, a real threat we need to tackle urgently. The number of adolescents affected by injuries is quite high too. Program access limited. The flagship RKSK program is struggling to reach adolescents. However, we also have hope. We have commitment to this group, then we can overcome all these problems soon. Thank you.
Good morning. I hope that you will be able to hear past the voice quality to what I have to say, but at least I'm pleased that I'm able to speak at all. The work that I'm going to share with you on empowerment is embedded in a much larger multi-country study, the Global Early Adolescence Study, which has taken place in 15 countries on 5 continents. We were interested, among many other things, in understanding empowerment in early adolescents, 10 to 14-year-olds. The reason why we were so interested is because there's so much work being done. There's so many investments programmatically in empowerment. So our starting point was there must be a construct, there must be a concept of empowerment. Last evening, I actually went online and Googled youth empowerment, and endless number of things came up. Youth empowerment in India, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, in the Philippines, and on and on and on. So there's so many programs. Somebody must know what youth empowerment is. Well, when we went out to look at the literature as the prelude to the work that we did, we saw many different concepts, constructs, and definitions. Youth empowerment, enhancement of assets and capabilities of diverse individuals and groups to engage, influence, and hold accountable the institutions that affect them. Bennett's definition. The expansion in people's ability to make strategic life choices in a context where this ability was previously denied, something internal to them. Another definition, and the definition that we use for our work, is the World Bank definition, the process of enhancing an individual or group's capacity to make effective choices. That is, to make choices and then to transform those choices into actions and outcomes. I'm going to come back to that at the end. But what that definition says is there are really 2 components. There's a process component to empowerment, and there is an outcome component. Agency is a key element as the thinking has been articulated, the ability to act on behalf of what you value. It emphasizes the individual's capacities. The process is the outcome, the opportunities, the process, the opportunity structure, the environments and circumstances that offer people the opportunity to exert agency. 2 parts, agency and opportunity structure. So when you look at the literature on empowerment, there's discussions on economic empowerment, the ability to control finances, and there are tremendous investments in the world, from the World Bank, from numerous donors in economic empowerment, particularly of women. Social cultural empowerment, the freedom of movement, family and interpersonal empowerment, domestic decision-making, legal empowerment, knowledge of rights, political empowerment, the ability to access the political system, psychological empowerment, self-esteem. Anju Malhotra, now at UNICEF, before at ICRW, has 4 dimensions of empowerment: freedom of movement, family and interpersonal empowerment, participation in domestic decision-making, psychological empowerment, self-esteem, economic empowerment, to control one's finances. What's a person going to believe? What's empowerment? There's a feminist definition of empowerment as well. The ability to question the status quo, to question norms, to voice opinions, resist coercion, soliciting desired and preferred outcomes. But what about a young person 10 years old, 11 years old? I don't know about you, but at the age of 10, I don't think I felt I had much power over anything. My world was defined and controlled by those outside of us. So to think about developing a measure of empowerment, we went to the literature, we looked at other measures, we developed a question bank, we drafted questions, we did face validity testing with 20 young people in 15 countries. We revised it, we then did pilot testing with 120 young people in 15 countries. That's each in 15 countries. And then we revised it, and we have repiloted it with 75 young people in 6 countries. So we started out believing, based on all of this work, that there were 5 dimensions of youth empowerment, particularly for young adolescents: voice, freedom of movement, decision-making or behavioral control, aspirations and expectations, and economic empowerment. So just to give you an example, my parent, for voice, the kinds of things that we wound up with. My parents or guardians ask for my opinion on things. My friends ask my advice when they have a problem. I can speak up in class when I have a comment or question. I can ask adults for help when I need it. These were the kinds of questions that young people, 10 to 14 years of age, told us were the questions that mattered in their lives. And so we developed these questions for each of these 3 domains. Originally, the 5 domains. But what we wound up with were 3 components of empowerment. Economic empowerment fell out. There is something different. Now, we had a huge debate that I'll spare you on whether economic empowerment had meaning for 10, 11, 12-year-olds. And it probably has meaning, but it's not related to empowerment, as best as we can see empirically. Additionally, expectations and aspirations. What I want to have happen to me, like school completion, and what I expect will happen to me, is very important, but it is not the same as empowerment. So we wound up with 3 dimensions: voice, behavioral control or decision-making, for example, clothes that you might wear when you're not in school or having to wear a uniform, and freedom of movement, to go after school activities, to sports clubs and things like that. The 3 dimensions. We tested these across all of 15 countries and then within each of 15 countries. And these scales, without going into the analytics of it, work. They work in each country that we looked at. That ranges from Shanghai in China to Cuenca in Ecuador to Ghent in Europe to Baltimore in the United States. Voice, decision-making, and freedom of movement. 3 core components of empowerment for young adolescents. So let me come back now to that World Bank definition: the process of enhancing an individual or group's capacity to make effective choices. Voice, freedom of movement, and decision-making are central. But there's a second part, and that's the opportunity structure. and then to transform those choices into desired actions and outcomes. The opportunity structure. So the investments programmatically in youth empowerment tend to focus on that first part, the capacity building, with very little, if any, attention to the opportunity structure. And that's a problem. Because to have the capacity and the inability to exercise that capacity does not advance either an individual or a nation or development. Amartya Sen said empowerment is central to development, which it is if it has both of those components. But our focus on the first and our ignoring the second is problematic. Secondly, the construct of empowerment need to be grounded in the lives and the contexts of which young people dwell. Empowerment of young people is about pushing the boundaries. But unless you know the boundaries, you neither know how to push them or where to push them or how far to push them. We need to understand the contexts. And we also need to understand that empowerment is a pathway to development. It is not necessarily a pathway to personal happiness. Because in fact, to be empowered in an environment that does neither tolerates nor supports that is to be at the margin of your community or your environment. We're about pushing the boundaries, but we need to support the people, and the young people particularly, who push those boundaries. Empowerment matters, but it requires opportunity as well as capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Blum. I would like you all to join me to welcome Tamara Krenin, who leads the Population and Reproductive Health Program at the Packard Foundation. Her experience in health and human services spans more than 25 years, and she has been a committed advocate and public policy advisor for sexual and reproductive health and rights across the globe. Throughout her career, she's been a passionate voice for social justice, social change, and adolescent and youth health. Tamara?
Thank you. Wow. Such a pleasure to be here. And really a special thank you to our researchers for giving us a view into the lives of 10 to 14-year-olds. And Bob, especially for elevating issues of agency and of empowerment, and of most of all, giving young people that opportunity for empowerment, critical to think about. It's been clear to all of us in this room that adolescents matter. And now I think it's even more clear that early adolescents matter. At the Packard Foundation, we focus on sexual reproductive health and rights. We think about services, we think about policies, and most of all, we think about social norms. And as I was listening to our researchers, I was thinking, what we really need to be about is understanding social norms and thinking about how we can shift social norms. At the Packard Foundation, we've long cared about youth. But more recently, we've had the feeling that young adolescents, that 10 to 14 age group, that age group that rarely shows up in our data, really are critical. and yet we have paid too little attention there. So we ourselves have done some refocusing. We think that we have to start early and we have to stay long, and that that's an important message for our policymakers, our communities, our parents, and our caregivers. When we think about young people at Packard, we think a lot about them as recipients of education and of services. And we like to think about what really makes a difference. How do they really understand what we have to teach them? And what matters to them when they go in to seek health care? We also think a lot about young people as movement builders, as activists. And we have come to think that even our youngest teens, our 10 to 14-year-olds, can also be leaders, that they themselves can guide and build on their strengths. And I think in Bob's research, he talks about letting the young people form the questions, and that's really important. When we think about young people, both as recipients and as movement builders, we like to look at the evidence. We like to look at research and think about what really works. And we like to listen to young people themselves. It's clear to me, listening to all the evidence we have heard today, that we have to pay keen attention to gender, that really matters when we look at programming for young people. Where we work with young people around the globe, from Mississippi to Amhara to Bihar, tends to be amidst poverty, violence, weak systems, and patriarchy. And with our global leaders right now, we are living particularly in an era of misogyny and patriarchy. And what we see is there are very few safety nets for young people and for people in general. This makes this life stage, this adolescent life stage, a period of marked vulnerability and a period where there is particular risk around sexuality for young people. And yet what we wish for those young people is to actually have a positive sexual experience, to have an age-appropriate sexual experience. That happens so rarely. So as we think about this, we realize we have to attend to the context that young people are living in. We have to think about the nuances of their lives. What are they going home to? What are they leaving to in the morning when they go to school or work? And what happens to them after school? What are their day-to-day lives like? The research and findings shared today are conveying a very important message. Sexual and reproductive health needs need to be addressed early in life, much earlier than we've been addressing them. And that may mean that when we do our programming, when we set our policies, we have to go out of our comfort levels. We have to think about where our young people are and cross those boundaries. Very young adolescents are vulnerable, and they have an urgent need for programmatic investments. Now, when I think about our various investments at the Foundation over the last 50 years, we think we've learned a few things. We have a lot more to learn, and we're going to keep listening keenly. We're going to keep investing in research and looking at the data, and also staying close to the ground and listening to the young people with whom we are working. But I'd like to share with you a few things that we have gleaned along the way. The evidence that was shared with you today should be seen as a call to action. And we should continue to have a bold call to action to our policymakers, our programmers, our donors, our researchers, and our evaluators to really broaden their vision, both to look at younger adolescents, but also to think about how we look at them. Are we looking at them from an empowering lens, from a lens in which we want them to have agency? We need to actively engage in dialogue with younger adolescents. Now, I think that's not so easy for people. It's very easy to look at the data, to talk about them, but to actually talk to them, to get down on the ground and sit with them and listen to them, they should be significant influencers in their communities. And we need to document and disseminate our experience working with young adolescents. And then we need to think about making positive investments on behalf of this future generation. As we think a lot about how we invest, we think we must look at context. I think one of the things that this particular Congress did that was very critical was look at mental health. We need to look at mental health. We need to think about self-esteem. We need to think about resilience. And all of this context really matters. The nuances of young people's lives matter. As we program and as we set policy, we need to think about unintended consequences. Now, for a long time, we've talked about ending child marriage with this generation. And I contend we still want to end child marriage. But as we are programming, as we are passing laws, we have to think about what then happens to those young people. What happens to those boys, and particularly what happens to those girls. So they don't get married off. What happens in the context of their families? Do we have a place for them to go? Can they continue their educations? Can they be productive members of society? Those unintended consequences really are important. We have to listen to our young people. We might not always like what they have to say, but we need to listen, we need to pay attention, and we need to let their voices lead. And we sometimes need to be the conveyor of their voices. We're at a moment of a lot of global processes. We've just finished the MDGs, now we're focused on the SDGs. We're thinking a lot about FP 2020, and we're counting a lot. As we count, we have to make sure that each young person who we are counting is treated with care. That their services, that the policies we make on their behalf reflect a very high quality of care and of compassion. We have to make sure we really understand the journey of young people's lives. Finally, I think we need to ask ourselves why this is so hard. Why is it that for years and years we have collected data on 15 to 19-year-olds? We've focused on these older young people. But we cringe a little bit when we talk about focusing on younger children, on younger adolescents. And I think it is partly because we are not comfortable thinking about sex and sexuality with younger adolescents, and we just take a deep breath and hope they will get through that part of their lives. But in fact, I think if we take some risks, if we look at this community of adolescents, we have a lot to gain. So let's be brave, let's attend to the data, and let's most of all attend to young people's voices and lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think I have much to say after that, but to round up the panel, I just wanted to highlight the three main things we want to make sure that you leave here today with, that there is a reality to adolescents' everyday lives, which is underlined by poverty, risk, and responsibility. There is a reality besides what is shown in the data. There is a reality besides what we want to change, and there are things that we have to take into consideration. As we think about adolescents' health and well-being, do we think about the opportunity structure, the unintended consequences, and the context in which they live? Thank you. And thank all of you. I will call on the organizers, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kate. Well, once again, we'd like to thank all our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. Ladies and gentlemen, now we'll be breaking for tea. It's in half an hour tea break, and with that, we also request that participants who are from the Middle East region, they are requested to meet at 4:30 in co-meeting room 3. So people who are from Middle East region request you to please join us at 4:30 in co-meeting room 3. And with that, we also have a wrist, there's this lost property. We found a wristwatch, so you all can check your wrist watches. If it's missing, you have to contact Mr. Gurvinder at the on-spot payment counter, and we'll be having networking dinner at 7:30. If you guys are interested in joining us, you have to make the registrations at the registration counter that's there in the pre-function area. And we have some more sessions coming up after tea break. That's at 11:30. This hall will be divided into 3. There'll be parallel 3 sessions going on, so you can check the itinerary according to your choice. You can choose the sessions. And thank you so much. Once again, we'd like to thank all our speakers. Please join us for tea and coffee. Thanks a lot here.
Hello, everybody. Kia ora, good morning, and welcome to the session that we're about to start. This is, in case you just got the wrong place, this is the session on safety and violence. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all, and we're going to have 6 very dynamic and interesting presentations. And I want to just introduce my co-chair, who is...
I'm Abigail Harrison. Good morning, everybody. I'm from Jamaica, and the outgoing IH VP for the Caribbean region. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's great to see so many of you. All right, so as Shanti mentioned, we're going to have 6 fabulous speakers, and we're going to start the ball rolling with Sharmista Basu, who is from the Population Council, New Delhi, and I'll just turn over to her now. Go right ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be with my learned colleagues and friends. I will be looking at how the exposure of violence in public and private space, that is home and community, affect the subsequent attitude and behavior of boys, that is adolescent boys. So this sample is drawn from a sample in Bihar, a state with very high prevalence of violence against women. Coming to the context, we have seen a growing body of literature in India shows that considerable proportion of young men report perpetrating violence against women and girls, that is both physical and sexual violence. The Youth in India survey has found that more than half of the young men aged 15 to 24 believe that they are entitled to perpetrate violence against their wife in at least one situation. However, in India, few studies have explored the factors that elevate the likelihood that adolescent boys and young men will hold attitude to condone violence and perpetrate violence against women and girls, as well as boys, that is bullying. The objective of my paper is to look at the linkages between adolescent boys and young men's exposure to violence. Here, exposure I have defined as witnessing as well as experiencing violence in private and public space, that is home and community, and their subsequent attitude and behavior. The outcome of interest is 3. First, I look at the adolescent boys and young men's attitude towards violence against women and girls. A set of 9 questions were probed for understanding boys' gender role attitude and notions of masculinity. Second, I look at the adolescent boys and women's perpetration, that is what they are doing, perpetration of violence against women and girls, as well as then I look at their perpetration against the boys, that is weaker and younger boys. And all these outcome variables I've taken from the Endline survey. My main explanatory variable, that is the violence, that is the exposure to violence in private and public space, and has been measured by using several variables. Exposure to violence in private space was captured by posing two questions, that is witnessing interparental violence, or they were hit by their parents since the age they were 12 years old. Exposure to violence in public space, on the other hand, was measured from response to 10 questions related to witnessing violence committed by friends and other men in the community and experiencing violence perpetrated by others in the community. And this was measured 12 months preceding the interview. So coming to the data and method, we have drawn this sample from a panel study of boys aged 13 to 21. They were members of youth club, and this study is a part of an intervention, Do Kadam Barabari Ke Or. This intervention was designed to change the violence-related attitude among boys. It was a randomized controlled trial, and survey was conducted before launching the intervention, as well as its completion at Endline, in the intervention as well as in the control arm. And this study is from the control arm, and there was 566 boys who were followed up, and only 517 boys could be followed up, and the duration was about 20 months after the first interview. And we controlled for the confounding factors from the baseline survey, that is age, religion, caste, schooling, wealth quintile, as well as boys' attitude and perpetration of violence at baseline. Coming to the analysis, linear regression model was used to examine the relationship between exposure of violence and attitude towards violence against women and girls, and logistic regression was used to examine the relationship between exposure of violence and perpetration against women as well as boys. And we used data to analyze this data. Now, looking at the findings, so the sample, if you see, they were the mean age of the sample was around 16 years. They were mostly Hindus coming from scheduled caste and other backward caste. And they were mostly studying in school or colleges and engaged in, about 18% were engaged in paid work in the last 12 months. Now, looking at the violence exposure, that is exposure to violence in private space, that is home, if you see that about 26% had witnessed interparental violence, that is father beating mother, and more than half had experienced violence themselves at home by their parents. Violence exposure in public spaces, which I told was measured by witnessing other men and boys in the community. Friends, if they have seen friends assaulting or abusing a girl, friends physical forcing a girl to have sex, beating their girlfriends. As in all this situation, if you see, it's about 13% in any of the above situation. And similarly, in experiencing violence, if they were teased or bullied in school by another boy, kicked, pushed, hair pulled by someone, and beaten or threatened, hit by threatened with a knife, forced to touch someone's private part, any of these situations is 37%. So this is the overall the experience and the witnessing situation at the community level. And so this is my main explanatory variable where I have distributed that I have looked at the combination that those boys which were not exposed to any kind of violence, that was around 29%. Those exposed to violence only in private space, that is home, was around 28%. And those were exposed to violence only in the public space, that is community, was around 11%. And those exposed to both home and community was around 32%.
2 minutes remaining.
Yeah, coming to the findings and my findings from the multivariate association, if you see that first looking at the attitude justifying violence, the linear regression, the factors, even after controlling for the confounding factors, you see that the boys who had experienced violence in home, that is private space, were significantly less likely than those who were not exposed to hold violence, attitude rejecting violence against women. If you see, and also if you see perpetration of violence against women, home is also coming out, that is first variable, only exposed to private space. That is also, if you see the odds ratio is higher and it is significant. However, exposing to both public and private space is increasing the likelihood of perpetration of violence. However, if you see that bullying, that is violence, perpetration of violence against younger and weaker boys, that is not affected by exposure to violence in their private space, and it is not significant. However, that is affected by exposure to violence in both community as well as public space. If there is like a effect of both, then they are more likely to perpetrate bullying. So coming to the conclusion, these findings bring attention to the role of family in perpetrating and engendering boys' attitude about violence against women and girls. And this finding underscored that there is a need to target and message, there is a need to have targeted messaging for parents and peers about the dangerous effect of violence and in home as well as in the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, that was an excellent paper, Sharmista. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Are there any questions? Is there a mic, or I'm going to ask you to just project? Oh, there is a mic. Perfect. If you could just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. I think they're recording, that's why they want it.
Myself, Smita, working in Madhya Pradesh in NRHM. I have a question that in Indian settings, parents beating their children is not, I don't know if it is called as a violence, because it's like you often see around, even in educated and good families, that beating a child, not severely, but for a, I don't know how to say, maybe slap a child is like very common. So how do you define violence in that context when you are saying that violence was perpetuated at home?
Sharmista, go ahead, you can answer.
Should I take like each and every?
You can take that one.
So the question we had directly asked was whether they have been beaten by their father or mother since the time they were 12 years old. That was the question we had asked to the 13 to 21-year-olds.
Could I follow up with a question? Did you choose 12 because prior to 12 you think that is culturally appropriate to get beat by your parents, and so you assumed if after 12 it was happening, then it qualified as violence?
And also the time duration, like 13 to 21, and so we have recall bias, so we have also only asked like till the time they were 12
From
years
12
old.
on. Okay. Any other questions?
Could I ask? Sharmista, I would like to ask a question since there's nothing else from the floor. I was wondering, because this is part of a trial, interventions evaluation, do you think the people who have agreed to take part in the trial are in some way different from those who might have not chosen to take part? Do you have any idea of the people in the study as opposed to those not in the study that might look at issues differently?
This is part of the control, and my colleague Santhya, she will be presenting actually findings from the intervention, so
Okay.
I'm not really exactly sure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce, I believe, somebody who's substituting for Professor Holly Shakya. Is that, that's right, okay, so that would be, I think, Anita Raj, is that right?
Yes.
Well, welcome, Anita. Anita's, I believe, from the Center on Gender Equity and Health at the University of California, San Diego, and she's going to be talking about husband-perpetrated violence and reproductive coercion. So over to you, Anita.
Hi, I'm presenting on behalf of the research PI for the grant, Dr. Jay Silverman, and Dr. Shakia is a PI on a supplement that focuses on social norms. This is a project from Niger that is an intervention study engaging married young couples, so married girls, and their husbands, and to understand how we can better support contraceptive use in this population in Niger. This study is baseline data from that. This particular set of analyses, I should say, is baseline data from that study. So a little bit background about Niger. Among childbearing age women, 78% are married before the age of 18, and about half of women of childbearing age gave birth before the age of 18. So this is some of the highest rates of early and child marriage and adolescent motherhood in the world. Only about 5.9%, so about 6% of married adolescents in Niger use contraception. And this is associated with higher rates of fertility, because you have a longer time span for fertility to occur, but also this very young motherhood increases their risk for complications and even death during pregnancy and childbirth. So a little bit about intimate partner violence and family planning. So this topic of reproductive coercion comes at the intersection of violence and family planning, two issues that are very much grounded in control and power and autonomy for women, or the stripping of that for women and girls. So in terms of intimate partner violence, our data from the United States, which gave rise to the issue of this topic of reproductive coercion, identified that women in the US who reported intimate partner violence were twice as likely to have a male partner refuse contraception, 80% more likely to have been coerced into becoming pregnant, and 3 times more likely to have been coerced to continuing a pregnancy when she wants to terminate that pregnancy. And so while we have a lot of data that documents that violence is associated with reproductive health outcomes, this notion of reproductive coercion is our conceptual framework for understanding, or concept that helps us understand how violence affects these poor reproductive health outcomes, and that we recognize that violence itself is sometimes a marker for other behaviors that impede women and girls' ability to control their own reproduction. So this is what really gave rise to the issue of reproductive coercion. We started these kinds of studies in the US. We have started adapting them. Dr. Silverman, again, is the lead on this. Been adapting them in the context of Niger, looking at it in Nigeria, looking at it in Mexico, looking at it in India. And the studies from Niger and India are the first ones we've got analysis on, and we're seeing very, very interesting and important findings. So this is from Niger, but I'm happy to talk about some of what we're seeing in other countries as well. So reproductive coercion is defined as a specific set of behaviors that directly or indirectly interfere with contraceptive decisions, access, or use, or with decisions or access to safe abortion, where the coercion is coming from a male partner. And for example, in the context of India, we expanded that to include in-laws. So what you can see is pregnancy coercion, threats or actual violence to women that force women to comply with demands that she become pregnant when she does not want to, so blocking access to family planning, blocking access to safe abortion services, but also contraceptive sabotage. There was a recent article in People magazine, which I know all of us love to read, it's in the US, it's a very I don't know what it is in India that's the equivalent, but like a glamour, not a glamour magazine, but like popular figures in society, or in media. And what it showed was oh, my husband wanted me to become pregnant and he just threw my birth control away. How romantic. But this is really an indication that there is a control situation, even if this was what she wanted to do or left. That's something that you should be having a conversation on. So that's called contraceptive sabotage, and that's something we've been seeing as well. So this study was focused on Niger to understand the issues of IPV and reproductive coercion on reproductive health among these married adolescent girls. Again, this is from a cluster randomized controlled trial that is an intervention trial to understand how to support married adolescents. Pathfinder is the PI on the implementation and program work for this. Baseline study is, we had 16 villages across 3 districts, and the final sample was 25 married adolescents and their husbands from each village, so that's about 1,100 dyads that provided us with these data. What we found was that about 1 in 10, so again, this is the first study of reproductive coercion in the context of Niger, about 1 in 10 reported some form of reproductive coercion, most commonly tried to force or pressure you to become pregnant or kept you from going to the clinic to receive family planning. And about 1 in 9 reported that they experienced some form of physical or sexual IPV from their husbands. So the initial models, or what we call the crude regression models that were analyzing some of these issues of IPV and reproductive coercion on family planning practices, found that there was an increased odds among women who among the married girls who experienced physical or sexual IPV from their husbands. They were about a 70% more likely chance of using family planning in the previous 12 months, and 30% more likely to intend to use it, but they were 30% more likely to experience an unintended pregnancy. So we are seeing an increased likelihood of using contraception, but also an increased likelihood of unintended pregnancy. And I should say, since we're in India, we have seen these same findings on the national scale in India. So we also looked at reproductive coercion, and they were almost twice as likely to report what we call covert or surreptitious. If they experienced reproductive coercion or these pressures not to have a baby on the part of their husbands, they were about almost twice as likely to report that they used family planning methods without their husband's knowledge, and 30% more likely to increase the intention to use these methods. This is just the adjusted analyses, and what we find is we continue to see these same findings even after adjusting for important covariates and even other forms of violence and control. People are nice enough to take the pictures, so I'm going to just hold it a second. And so what we're concluding from this is that, look, we see a finding that is really going against a lot of what people have been saying about the intersection of IPV and family planning, and we're seeing this across a number of our national analyses, including Jordan and India, as I said, that the women and girls who are reporting IPV are actually more likely to use contraception. But they are also, 1 in 3 participants who used contraceptives in this sample did so without their husband's knowledge. And that conflict with husbands over FP is indicated by findings related to this reproductive coercion issue, where we saw the reproductive coercion increases the likelihood of this covert or surreptitious use occurring. So what we're finding from this study, and again, as well in other studies, is that this issue of husband violence and coercion has an effect on reproductive practices of women, and what it is doing is not necessarily what we historically thought that was happening. We think that with the rise in accessibility and supply, more stable supply of contraceptive services, that women have a greater access, that they are able to engage with it covertly. And while this study, we didn't have discontinuation data at a sufficient end to allow us to kind of explore this, we are going to be looking at some of the for the DHS data, and in the context of India, when we looked at this, what we found was that we did see this, as we discussed in the US, the unintended pregnancy practice, that we believe that it is that they are trying to get the contraception, but this discontinuation is affected because they are having to use the contraception surreptitiously. So there is a program that we have developed to try to address this concern, which is called Reproductive Arches, which focuses on the issue of reproductive coercion, this intersection of violence and reproductive control. And what it is designed to do is for those women who are contending with this issue, how to support them to engage in family planning practices in access that they can use safely and without concerns related to discontinuation. Long-acting reversible, long-acting reversible contraceptives are clearly important in this regard, but we also need to be supporting the counseling of women to meet them where they're at. We also believe in male engagement programs, but we recognize that male engagement programs are not going to work in contexts where these men want to use contraception, want to has a child and the woman or the girl is not ready. So we need to be providing not just an array of contraceptives, which is what we've really been focusing on in the field of reproductive health, and particularly adolescent reproductive health, but we need to also be focusing on a variety of counseling approaches to better meet the needs of girls who are facing violence and coercion, reproductive coercion in their relationships. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. It's obviously a very interesting glimpse of a very large study, multi-center study, but thank you for that presentation on behalf of your colleagues. Questions from the floor? There's 2 questions, yeah. we'll take both questions, and then Anita, I'll just get you to answer them at the same time.
Excellent presentation. My name is Dr. Bulbul Sood. I'm the Japaigo Country Director in India. When you're talking about what has been the experience of couple counseling, if it has been done? So I would want to know what's happening in Nigeria. The second is you talked about the long-acting reversible methods for young people, but I've seen that the violence will be still there. And as I recollect an incident where there was a young woman who came and wanted an IUCD, and in Indian context we always say, have you discussed it with your husband and have you discussed with your mother-in-laws, because you said, as I said, they're also part of the extended family and important decision maker. And she said yes, and I remember IUCD was inserted. Next morning when we reached this clinic, we find that there were hordes of about 100 women outside, and I believe this woman went back to her house, and mother said little pain, and the husband said why, and when she told the reason, she was beaten up and thrown out of the house. So the next day, so I'm just thinking that maybe the couple, I think we have to come out with the solutions also, what needs to be done at the program level to address this issue. So if you have experience, I would love to know.
Thank you. And there's one other question.
So on the other side of reproductive coercion, we've seen a lot of cases where, and I know it becomes a little more complicated for adolescents, but where women or girls in some cases who actually become pregnant might want to keep the child, but in countries where female feticide and infanticide are big issues, forced abortion can be equally traumatizing.
Yes.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So maybe we'll actually get those two questions answered first, and if we have time, we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we actually, in the original measures, so measurement is an area of expertise for us that we really focus on, and we have to combine the notion of what works for a statistical analysis of measurement with what is conceptually meaningful. And we didn't have the numbers of women who were forced to have abortion, but we absolutely agree that that's a form of reproductive coercion, and we also agree that there's aspects of reproductive coercion that come at the hands, and we know this, we've seen this in many countries, at the hands of the providers themselves to force contraceptives practices that may not be what the women want. So I want to kind of highlight what you said, because I think it's really important. This issue where she used the contraceptive, she went home, she told, and she was beaten. And we even have this other issue, which she goes home, no one ever knows she doesn't have contraceptives, but she doesn't have a child, and she is beaten. This is not a resolution. The reproductive coercion counseling, the ARCHES system, is not designed to affect IPV. It is meant to be done in conjunction with IPV prevention efforts. It is offered at an individual level, which we know is inadequate. This is an array of methods that can be offered to provide short-term support, but broader social change is needed. Look, if we could eliminate the notion that other people get to control a woman or girl's body about reproduction, then we wouldn't need these. But that's going to take longer, and so this is sort of in the shorter term. We think that we need to be doing a combination of this sort of coercive, this notion of reproductive coercion to prepare women to understand that she remains at risk from this violence, and that the risk for violence when practicing contraceptives may increase as well. That has to be part of the counseling, and that is part of the reproductive coercion counseling. So again, it's an array of services, and we don't recommend it. If men can be engaged, if families can be engaged, we have another program called CHARM that engages men. That's been very successful, but we know that it doesn't work when men can't be engaged, or they're very resistant, or they're highly abusive.
So on that note, we might just bring it to a closure because time's up, but thank you very much,
Thank you
Anita.
so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we move on to our third speaker. I'm going to ask Shubha Bhattacharya to come to the podium.
Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Shubha from ICRW, And I also have my colleagues in the audience who I would request to come in at whenever it's required. I'm going to present on a program, a school-based primary prevention program, and the impact of the program on bystander intervention. So I'm going to begin with a quote from one of the participants of our program, who says this: "Earlier, whenever a friend would call me names or abuse me, I would get angry and beat them up till they would start crying badly. But I try to control my temper now. No problem gets resolved by hitting and using violence. Now me and my friends get together during the lunch break, and whenever we see younger children getting into physical fights, we stop them, and if they don't listen, we tell our teachers." However, this discourse of children intervening to stop violence is not bereft of challenges. These are some of the questions that some of the students had. But what if they abuse me when I try to stop them? I fear intervening in fights amongst elders, as they may hit me back and hurt me. I've tried to reason out so often, but they just don't listen. So as I said, intervening to stop violence is extremely challenging, especially for young adolescents with limited voice and agency. So just to put this in context, I'll talk about the program that has been running in Jharkhand from 2014 to 2016. It's called the Gender Equity Movement in Schools, the GEMS program. It's a school-based primary prevention program for young adolescents aged 12 to 14 years, studying in grades 6 to 8, and it aims to foster gender equality, redefine masculinity, and negate all forms of violence. GEMS stands on 4 basic conceptual pillars, or as we like to call it, the core principles of the GEMS program. The first is starting young, because we believe that inequitable gender norms and attitudes are learned and internalized at very young ages, and they have long-lasting impacts on opportunities, aspirations, health and well-being, relationships between people of all genders, etc. And these inequitable norms need to be questioned and challenged, and this needs to start being done at a very young age, and hence starting young. The second pillar of the GEMS program is working with both girls and boys, because the GEMS program looks at addressing GBV as a paradigm of power that reinforces gender stereotypes, and we want to, through the GEMS program, look at challenging the power imbalance between genders through working with both girls and boys. The third conceptual pillar is using transformative approaches, gender transformative approaches, which seeks to challenge, recognize, and transform gender relations through critiquing, challenging existing gender norms. And the fourth is working with institutions. So working with institutions like schools, for instance, which is the primary institution that the GEMS program focuses on, because we understand that these are key socialization institutions where students learn gender inequitable norms and values at very young ages, and hence working with institutions. As I've already spoken about the 4 pillars of the GEMS program, I'm going to quickly go through what GEMS uses, multiple strategies. One is, of course, institutional engagement, as I've spoken of. The second is group education activities, which are classroom sessions, which are teacher-led, 24 sessions of 45 minutes each, sessions spread across 2 academic years, sessions on gender, body changes, violence, relationship, emotions, communication, amongst others. And of course, using participatory methodologies like role plays, debates, stories, and situations, encouraging lots of discussion, reflections, and questioning. School campaigns is again one of the most important strategies that GEMS uses to reinforce messages on gender equality and nonviolence. We have an innovative tool called the GEMS Diary, My GEMS Diary, which children have used and have really liked to use to take the discussions on gender and violence back to their communities and their homes. We've also had community campaigns within the GEMS program to engage parents and the community on the discourse around gender and violence. So the GEMS program in Jharkhand began in 2014, and ended in 2016 across 40 government schools in Ranchi and Kooty districts of Jharkhand state of India. This covered 4,000 girls and boys from classes 6 to 8, and we reached out to 300 teachers who were trained specifically on various issues around gender and violence. And this program was implemented by ICRW in partnership with 2 program organizations in Jharkhand, Sini and Leeds. I'll quickly come to the evaluation. So the evaluation of the program was a randomized control longitudinal design, and mixed methods of data collection were used. We reached out to 80 schools, around 3,000 students, and 3 rounds of data collection. We had baseline, midline, and endline. 60 in-depth interviews were conducted with girls and boys from GEMS and non-GEMS schools. The key outcome indicators, as you can see, were related to gender and violence, interaction between girls and boys, communication with teachers, bystander intervention, perpetration of violence. A key factor, a key component of the GEMS program has been reflection and questioning of existing gender norms, of inequitable gender norms, and violent behavior and attitudes. So some of the questions that used to come in the classes during the sessions are on your screen. Coming to the findings, amongst many other findings, I'm going to focus on a couple of findings on violence. So we see a positive and significant shift in attitude with respect to gender and violence among students in the intervention in the GEMS schools. So we see an increase in proportion of students who disagreed with corporal punishment and peer violence post the GEMS program. And this is also, the quantitative data is also corroborated by qualitative data. Herein we see that at baseline, 31% students from the GEMS schools and 33% students from non-GEMS schools disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement that it is fine for teachers to give physical punishment to students in certain situations. And this proportion increased to 56% at endline in intervention schools and 40% in non-GEMS schools. So there is a net increase of 17% in the GEMS schools.
Shubha, you have 2 minutes remaining.
Oh, okay. That's, I'm going to quickly go on to enhanced recognition. So the evaluation also found that the program has resulted in enhanced recognition of violence and increase in positive bystander intervention for different forms of violence among students in GEM schools, wherein we see 43% students from GEM schools who reported witnessing physical violence, which increased to 53% in midline and reduced to 46% at endline. And this increase in the midline, we think could be due to an increased recognition and articulation, as seen also in the narratives and qualitative data. As far as bystander intervention is concerned, we do see that boys from GEM schools have reported an increase in positive action in case of physical violence, where they've tried to stop the perpetrator and reported to their teachers or principals on having witnessed physical violence, and reduction in the use of negative action, that is using violence, like hitting or using abusive language against the perpetrator, to stop emotional violence. And there was also an increase in, a significant increase in the proportion of girls reporting positive action in case of emotional violence, and decline in negative action in case of sexual violence in the non-GEM schools, in the GEM schools, I'm sorry. However, as I said in the beginning, that these are not bereft of challenges, and not all boys and girls have been able to intervene on having witnessed violence. Some have shared various emotional expressions, like they've been scared, helpless, pained, alarmed. They've ran off for the fear of being hit. But the difference between the GEM students and non-GEM students has been that GEM students have recognized and critiqued that yes, this is violence and this needs to be, that this is not correct. However, amongst non-GEM students, we see a higher acceptance of violence. So these are just, I'm going to leave you with some quotes from students of our GEM schools.
I think we're going to ask them to just read it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shubha. That's a nice study, actually. I'm going to open up to the floor now for any questions. Okay, I'll start off. I'm just clarifying, at what point did you do the follow-up survey? How many months after intervention?
So we began, and I would also request Nandita, Pranita to come in here. Our baseline happened in 2014, and then a year after that, the midline was done, and again another year of intervention in the schools, after which the endline survey was done.
Okay, and do you have any plans of looking at them when they're older? Because oftentimes we find that attitudes change in short term, but maybe not behavior for the long term. So do you have any plans for that? Okay. Always a challenge. Any other questions from the floor? Or
if
from
not,
you,
I was just wondering actually, it was a fascinating presentation. I know you would have liked to have shared a lot more, but I wondered whether your work with the teachers was insightful, because one of the things that I knew you were expecting was some of the quotes at the start said, well, they'll tell a teacher if they see something on the playground. What if the teachers then use violence? That is not uncommon in school settings. Did you see any changes in that regard?
So actually it's been quite an interesting journey of the teachers themselves, and we've also, in our evaluation report, we also have a section on reflections that teachers have had. So their journeys have been quite fascinating.
Sure.
Because we've had a lot of gender trainings with the teachers themselves, wherein initially there was a lot of resistance from the teachers in terms of just saying that, yes, what if, so you are opening up the discussion around so many forms of violence, and a lot of them are actually, we not only use and condone them, but but the change, yes, there has been a lot of change amongst the teachers also, because and in their personal lives as well, not just in the classroom scenario, but within their personal lives as well. They've reflected and spoken about having experienced or having perpetrated violence. Male teachers, their journeys have also been quite interesting. So a lot of resistance in the beginning, and also it continues, but the journey has been fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, we have 2 questions. We'll take them quickly, one here and one at the back.
Did you see a ripple effect of violence at home, I'm saying, because several times, child-to-child programs have proven to be very effective. So with these boys and girls, when they went back to the homes, did they talk about, issues about violence and gender-based violence and other things? And did you see any effect on families?
So especially in our qualitative data, we have been able to actually, so it's interesting because at the midline we see an increase, a heightened increase in articulation on violence amongst violence that children have. They started speaking a lot, recognizing violence a lot more, and yes, they did speak of having gone back and shared and at home about what they've learned in the program around gender-based violence and inequitable gender norms as well. And wherever they've got a supportive environment at home, they've continued to kind of believe and also behave in a certain way positively. But there have also been situations where they've actually, yes, faced some bit of violence. There has been backlash, and for some students, so we've seen in our endline data that some students have actually gone quiet, who actually spoke so much about having experienced or having instances of intervening to stop violence at home. They went quiet at the end line, and then when we probed around what the reasons could be, we realized that there has been certain backlash at home or around in their neighborhood or in the social environment.
We're going to very quickly take the last question. I hope it's short.
So maybe I've missed. I was just wondering whether you had parent sessions in school.
Yeah, so
because actually I'm involved in one such program, and I have like 2 big barriers which I felt was, one was involving parents and one convincing teachers to talk about it, because once we leave the school, the sustainability is on teachers and parents. So I was just wondering your thoughts on it and what you have done in your program to overcome these. Thank you.
So yeah, in the schools, we've actually, to engage parents, we've had community campaigns wherein parents of all students were invited, and children and students got together and they did various participatory activities like games and role plays and drama, a lot of those kinds of participatory activities around speaking on the issue of gender and violence. And we've also had SMC meetings at regular intervals to keep them in loop on what is happening. So these are some of the things that have happened. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Shubha.
Thank you.
All right. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Santhair, who's from the Population Council. And I think Santhair's presentation is going to link back to the first presentation that Shamista had, and you presented the evaluation.
That's right.
Fantastic.
Good morning, everyone. In the previous plenary session, we heard, based on benchmarking data, the need for working with younger adolescents. And in this presentation, based on an intervention study, I'm going to highlight why do we need to start early. Just to give you a little bit about the context in India, India made a lot of commitments for preventing violence. In fact, India is a signatory to the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which emphasizes on gender equity, and it calls for the nations to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. You have heard in the previous day, India has this comprehensive national adolescent health program, and one of the priority themes emphasized in that strategy is prevention of violence. We have laws which, make sexual violence against children illegal, and it can be, even those who witness are supposed to report based on this act. Why do we need to engage with boys early? Well, the first thing all of us may say is that, well, they are the perpetrators. Yes, they do perpetrate, even at the early age. We see that this is based on a large-scale study the Population Council very recently conducted in 2 states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where we interviewed over 20,000 adolescents. And if you look at from the left side bars, you see about 25 to 29% of younger boys aged 10 to 14 reported that they had bullied somebody in the year preceding the interview. They have been involved in physical fights with other boys. And, they do, what we call in India, eve-teasing, especially the older ones. These are all statistics which will tell us that boys are perpetrators. But they are not just simply perpetrating, they are also victims of violence. Somebody in the previous question asked, the parents' slap, should it be considered violence? Well, it is asked married women in the community will say, oh, my husband gave me a slap, that's not violence. That's unfortunately the culture where violence is so normalized. So you see that 64 to 71% of younger boys have been beaten or otherwise physically harassed by their parents since they turned the age of 10. And this is a culture in which our young men, learn how to perpetrate violence against women. And intervening with the boys is important, not because they are the victims or perpetrators of violence. They also have their own needs, which we often, ignore. The first, bar shows that a lot of them don't have an aspiration. They don't know what they should be becoming when they get to the adulthood. And also, many of them don't have the agency to decide how many years of schooling they should have. We think that these are all, day-to-day personal choices. People should have choice, but they don't have.